Hello and welcome along to a brand new episode of Aviation Analysis, the channel that is dedicated to investigating the craziest, bizarre and mysterious stories from the skies. In today's technological world, health and safety is paramount to the functioning of business, staffing and efficiency with regards to airline travel. The responsibility of those involved in the transportation of people, animals and luggage from point A to B, from check-in clerks to the pilots, is colossal and requires constant funding and upgrades. Yet, despite the professionalism and efforts of security personnel, air traffic control and navigators, the margin for error is so fine that, inevitably, issues may occur. Though many disasters have been avoided over the years, there have been instances where tragedy had befell those who took to the sky. On today's episode, we will examine the case of Air India Flight 182, a passenger jet that exploded off the coast of Ireland on June 23, 1985. A horrific encounter that killed all 329 passengers and crew members on board. What happened that day that resulted in such a massive loss of life? Who was responsible, and what were their motives behind the explosion? And what was the immediate and long-term aftermath of the event? Join us as we attempt to understand and dissect the tragic case of Air India Flight 182. Without downplaying the enormity of the tragedy, we must take a few minutes to clarify what happened that day in 1985 by providing a brief summarization of the case. Flight 182 was a Boeing 747-237B passenger flight, registered Victor Tango Echo Foxtrot Oscar, which was planned to depart from Toronto, Canada to London via Mumbai. The aircraft made a stop in Montreal, where it is noted that officials had extracted a total of 3 suspicious items from the plane before it took flight for its scheduled path towards the UK capital. Communication was made with air traffic control staff at Heathrow Airport's aerial tower in advance of the planned descent. However, 45 minutes before the flight was due to arrive, the plane exploded and fragmented in mid-air at an altitude of 31,000 feet. Remnants of the aircraft fell into the sea off the coast of Ireland, along with the bodies of those who were on board. Victims included 268 Canadian citizens, 27 British citizens, and 22 Indian citizens. Before the explosion, there were no records of emergency calls or distress signals being issued. After the plane disappeared from local ATC, emergency search teams were dispatched to the last known coordinates. However, despite their best efforts, no survivors were found. During the panic, immediate investigation and attempts at rescue, the actual cause of the crash was not identified or known. It would later be suspected that Sikh extremists had purposely planted explosives on board the flight as a reaction to the civil unrest between Sikh and Hindu factions, which was rife in the 1980s. In the end, 2 suspects were arrested. 5 months after the disaster, Canadian police declared that a suspect by the name of Talwinder Singh Parmar had been behind the attack. The second person of interest was Inderjit Singh Rayat, a Sikh residing in Vancouver who pleaded guilty to manslaughter in connection with the bombing and was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2003. Rayat had also been sentenced to 10 years assisting terrorists with the building of an explosive which killed 2 baggage handlers at Japan's Narita airport on the same day as the Flight 182 disaster. The bombing of Air India Flight 182 is recorded as the worst terrorist attack in Canada's and Air India's history, and was the world's deadliest act of aviation terrorism until the 9/11 attacks in New York City in 2001. In 2006, a Canadian commission was assembled to investigate the disaster, and the results were eventually released in 2010, citing a cascading series of errors relating to the country's security and intelligence agencies' failures to relay information, especially due to the ongoing conflict amongst the Sikhs and Hindus. In the end, only 131 bodies have ever been retrieved. So, now that we know what happened all those years ago, let us now dig deeper into the details and aftermath of the bombing, both socially and from an aviation standpoint. The incident itself was said to have been planned and conducted by Sikh separatists as they sought revenge for the Indian Army's attack on the Golden Temple in Punjab in 1984. Armed forces implemented the assault on the temple in Amritsar in an attempt to remove Sikhs who were calling for an independent homeland called Khalistan. Approximately 400 people, including 87 soldiers, were killed during the mission, which became known as Operation Blue Star, although many groups have since claimed that the number of casualties were in the thousands. Separatists claimed that troops were intruding upon and defiling the holy shrine, thus leading to rising tensions and the eventual conflict. And so, a year later, on the 23rd of June 1985, Air India Flight 182, also nicknamed Kanishka, set off from Toronto via Montreal's Mirabel International Airport towards the United Kingdom and eventually Delhi, the unfortunate passengers being completely unaware of what was about to happen. At approximately 7:14 AM GMT, a bomb which had managed to go undetected by crew members and had been stored in the cargo hold section of the aircraft ignited off the coast of Ireland, near Cork. The black box was later recovered from a depth of over 6,700 feet. As mentioned, a committee-led investigation was conducted primarily via the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, with assistance from international agencies such as the FBI and Irish police. The initial findings led the investigative teams to declare that the explosion was a deliberate act of sabotage as opposed to a mechanical or technical failure. Not long after this assumption, it became clear that a bomb was present at the time of the explosion. After a thorough review and analysis of events, intelligence services concluded that two separate bombs had strategically been placed in the checked baggage facility at Vancouver International Airport, unearthing an extreme lack of security at the terminal. Each bag was then moved onto their connecting flights, the devices that exploded in Tokyo and that of Flight 182. From there, teams focused their attention on two suspects, who they believed to have orchestrated the heinous acts. First was Inderjit Singh Rayat, the electrician who they believe was involved in assembling the bombs. Then there was Talwinder Singh Parmar, the key figure and suspected architect of the attack. Parmar rose to power in 1979 as the leader of the Baba Khalsa in Canada, a Sikh militant group. During the year of the bombing, Parmar travelled across the country to establish himself as a pro-leading Khalistani Sikh. He commanded Sikhs to unite, fight and kill, in retaliation of the Indian government's conduct and that of Operation Blue Star. It is reported that Parmar's telephone had been tapped by CSIS for 3 months before the bombing occurred. After numerous criminal and terrorist accusations, he escaped to India in 1988, but was subsequently killed in a shootout with Punjab Armed Police in October 1992. Yet, as recently as July 2023, posters of Parmar were spotted and reported across Canada to advertise a car rally in his honour, declaring him as a martyr for the Sikh separatist cause. The Canadian government condemned the use of the posters, stating that they glorify violence and terrorism. In 2003, Ripu Daman Singh Malik and Ajaib Singh Bagri, fellow members of the Baba Khalsa separatist group, were charged with murder and conspiracy. After a 2-year trial, both men were acquitted down to a lack of clear evidence and witnesses. In 2006, a year after their acquittal, the Canadian government set up a brand new public inquiry, which was spearheaded by the former Canadian Supreme Court Justice John Major. Its conclusion, in 2010, reported multiple issues pertaining to Air India itself. This included a failure of information sharing by CSIS and RCMP teams with regards to threats posed by terrorist groups of potential attacks and bombings. Major's report also scathed the security protocols and failure to source, spot and remove the bomb that ultimately destroyed the plane and killed those on board. The document also ridiculed the government's response, behaviour and treatments towards the victims' families, something that tends to get overlooked in such cases. In the end, a total of 64 recommendations were proposed by Major and his team in relation to all 3 subjects. The conclusive report culminated in a public and formal apology by then Prime Minister Stephen Harper to the families of those killed. Thankfully, and as expected, the Canadian aviation industry implemented a variety of changes and rigid protocols and procedures with regards to security, screening and passenger checks, as well as investigating in the most up-to-date explosive detection technologies. The prosecution, as well as the subsequent investigative reports and commissions, became the most expensive trial in Canadian history, costing in excess of 130 million Canadian dollars. So, Whatever happened to the two men who were acquitted in 2005 of the atrocity? Not much is known about Anjab Singh Bagri's whereabouts and the life after the trial. However, Ripudaman Singh Malik would make the headlines again in 2002 for very different reasons. Two men named Tanner Fox and Jose Lopez pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of Malik in 2022 in a Canadian court. They entered their pleas in British Columbia Supreme Court the day before they were set to go on trial for murder in the first degree. On the 14th of July that year, Malik was sitting in his car just outside the building of his family business in Surrey, British Columbia, when both men appeared and shot him multiple times. Statement of facts detail how Fox and Lopez's movements were captured on various surveillance cameras and traffic cameras on the day before and on the day of the murder. They were seen driving a stolen vehicle as well as a backup vehicle with amended license plate numbers to carry out the murder. A white Honda CR-V and a black Infiniti used were owned by persons unrelated to the homicide. Official statements from both Fox and Lopez declared that they were hired to carry out the murder of Malik, but the evidence could not precisely pinpoint where the contract originated and who was behind their hiring. After a raid, police recovered 2 handguns from the assassins' homes, as well as a total of $16,485 Canadian dollars in cash in Lopez's new Westminster apartment. The guns were subsequently linked to the murder after forensic analysis. At one point during the trial, Fox and Lopez got into an argument in the new Westminster courtrooms. This escalated quickly into a fistfight, where both men punched and clawed at each other, according to the Vancouver Sun newspaper, before sheriff staff prized them apart. As of today, both men await final sentencing. However, Malik's family have issued a statement urging them to cooperate with police to assist in finding all those involved in the killing. The statement included that until the parties responsible for hiring them and directing this assassination are brought to justice, the work remains incomplete. The bombing of Flight 182 has been the subject of recent discussions between Ottawa and New Delhi governing parties due to recent tensions between India and Canada. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau alleged that the Indian government was involved in the assassination of Malik, something which they strongly deny. The Indian Consulate General in Vancouver discussed the country's approach to security and tackling terrorism on a national and international scale by stating, "India stands at the forefront of countering the menace of terrorism and works closely with all nations to tackle this global threat." India-origin Canadian MP Chandra Arya also expressed solidarity with the victims' families and condemned all forms of terror-related attacks, both foreign and domestic. And so, with the investigation remaining wide open, we come to the end of this episode of Aviation Analysis, in the hope that those responsible for the bombing are finally brought to justice. As the world continues to boost its security, prevention and response to all forms of terrorism, especially those where hijacking, bombing and other forms of large-scale murder is concerned, we must always be aware and vigilant ourselves. It is easy to read the statistics and numbers of those who have lost their lives in such attacks. However, we must acknowledge that each individual was someone's daughter, son, friend or other loved one to someone else. There will always be a threat by those wishing us harm, whether it be a religious, militarized or another for ideological insanity. Let us hope that governments, technological experts and counter-terror agencies are able to prevent these atrocities from ever happening again. We hope that today's episode sheds light on what happened that day in 1985 and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care out there, folks.